Hold it, stop. Everybody, stop. The gavel crashes down harder than usual. Judge Frank Caprio's complexion fades as his eyes lock on the figure before him. The defendant smirks, arms folded, recognition flashing in his stare. Well, little Frankie Caprio. A collective gasp sweeps the courtroom. For decades of buried memories are about to erupt. This isn't just another trial. This is payback. The defendant leans forward, his voice oozing with satisfaction. Do you remember me now, Your Honor? Frank's fingers clutch the bench, knuckles whitening. Cameras continue rolling. The spectators sit frozen, holding their breath. What happens when a judge is suddenly confronted by the tormentor of his childhood? What happens when that same bully stands accused of fraud, smirking as if he owns the courtroom? Subscribe immediately, because what unfolds next will shatter everything you thought you knew about justice, redemption, and the collision between past and present. The day had begun like any other inside Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio took his seat, adjusted his robes, and settled into the rhythm of proceedings. Case after case passed by, parking tickets, petty offenses, the usual stream of human missteps requiring both his judgment and, often, his compassion. Next case, Frank called, glancing down at the docket. The State versus Anthony Duca. Charges, financial fraud and embezzlement. The bailiff opened the door. In walked a man in his mid-60s, tailored suit, confident stride. He carried himself like someone who had never been denied, never truly punished. As he neared the defendant's table, something tugged at Frank's memory. The walk. The posture. The tilt of his head. Mr. Duca, Frank began, then stopped cold. Their eyes locked across 40 years of history and pain. Anthony Duca. Tony the Tank. The terror of Federal Hill back in the 1960s. The boy who had turned young Frankie Caprio's life into a daily nightmare after school. The brute who shoved him into lockers, stole his lunch money, mocked him in front of girls, and once left him with a black eye so severe his mother wept when she saw it. But what no one in that courtroom yet realized was that this hearing was about to ignite into the most explosive showdown in Providence Municipal Court's history. Frank's mind snapped back to a frigid December afternoon in 1963. 12-year-old Frankie trudged home from school, clutching his books tightly to his chest, when Tony Duca blocked his path behind DeMarco's grocery store. "Hey, Guinea boy," Tony had spat, the slur slicing deep into Frankie's Italian pride. "Your father still patching shoes for scraps?" The beating that followed gave Frank more than just bruises, it carved into him a relentless drive to prove that being small was never the same as being weak. "Do you remember me, Mr. Duca?" Frank asked softly, his voice steady even as a storm churned inside him. Tony's smirk deepened. "Oh, I remember you, all right, little Frankie. Look at you now, perched up there in those fine robes. Who would have guessed the kid I used to thrash would one day be the one passing judgment on me?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Camera crews leaned in, sensing lightning in a bottle. This wasn't routine procedure anymore. This was headline material. But Judge Frank Caprio hadn't earned his place as Providence's most cherished judge by letting his feelings take the wheel. His entire legacy was built on fairness, compassion, and the rare ability to see humanity in every person who stood before him, even bullies. Even Tony Duca. "Mr. Duca," Frank said, his tone sharpening, "you are accused of embezzling $50,000 from the youth center where you were employed. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Tony replied, mock respect dripping from his words, that same arrogant grin plastered across his face. Frank opened the case file, and the words inside made his veins turn cold. The East Side Youth Center, the very same center where Frank's own grandson volunteered. The same place that supported children just like young Frankie once was, poor immigrant kids, desperate for someone to believe in them. "Mr. Duca," Frank continued, "this document states that you served as activities director at East Side Youth Center for 2 years. Your duties included organizing sports programs, educational activities, and overseeing budgets for children's services." "That's correct," Tony said with a nod. "And according to this complaint," Frank pressed on, "you generated fraudulent invoices, redirected funds meant for children's programs into your personal account, and when questioned, you dismissed it as bookkeeping mistakes. Tony gave a careless shrug. Errors happen. That was the moment Frank's composure cracked, just a hairline fracture. Mistakes, he said, voice rising. Mr. Duca, you stole Christmas gifts from children who had nothing. You drained money meant to buy sports equipment for kids who could never afford it otherwise. You robbed hope from those who have almost none to begin with. Hit that subscribe button and enable notifications, because this standoff is about to erupt into a boiling point that will leave you stunned. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding more evidence. Your Honor, we have. Bank statements revealed that Mr. Duca funneled the stolen money into an Atlantic City getaway, lavish dinners, and gambling sprees, while the kids at the center went without fresh basketballs or new soccer cleats. The defendant was eating lobster and playing cards while children were left with nothing. Frank fixed his eyes on Tony Duca, the same man who had haunted his childhood, now accused of preying on children in another form. The irony was sharp. The bully hadn't changed, he had simply grown into a bully of the powerless. Mr. Duca, Frank said deliberately, his tone heavy, I want you to grasp something. I've sat on this bench through thousands of cases. I've presided over murders, assaults, robberies. But what you've done, stealing hope from children, stands among the vilest acts I've ever encountered. For the first time, Tony's smirk wavered. Come on, Your Honor, he said, forcing a laugh. Don't you think you're taking this a little personally, considering our history? The room froze. Everyone could feel something hidden beneath the surface, though few understood what. Frank leaned forward. You want to bring up history, Mr. Duca? Fine. Let's bring it up. 43 years ago, you cornered a 12-year-old boy behind DeMarco's grocery. You mocked him. You beat him. You made his life a nightmare. That boy went home with a black eye and told his mother he'd fallen off his bicycle, because he was too ashamed to admit he had been bullied. The courtroom was spellbound. The cameras zoomed closer. This was no ordinary proceeding. That boy, Frank continued, his voice strengthening, swore that day that if he ever gained the power to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, he would. He vowed that the next time he faced bullies like you, he would not shrink back. Tony's complexion drained. His trademark smirk had vanished. Today, Mr. Duca, Frank declared, you are not standing before little Frankie Caprio, the boy who once feared you. You are standing before Judge Frank Caprio, a man who has spent his life shielding people exactly like the children you stole from. But Frank wasn't finished. What happened next would cement itself as the most unforgettable courtroom moment in Providence Municipal Court's history. Before I pronounce sentence, Frank said, I want you to understand who those children are that you stole from. I want you to hear about Maria Santos, 8 years old, whose parents worked 3 jobs between them and were counting on the Christmas party you canceled with their money. I want you to hear about Tommy Chin, age 10, he spent months saving just to join the basketball league you shut down when you siphoned off the equipment fund. Frank's voice thundered with righteous anger. These children remind me of myself at their age. They come from families that scrape by, who sacrifice, who put their faith in places like the East Side Youth Center to provide the chances they never had. Tony shifted in his chair, clearly uneasy. Look, Your Honor, I think you're making this too. I'm not finished, Frank cut in sharply, his gavel slamming against the bench with authority. Do you know what separates you from me, Mr. Duca? When I was small, bullies like you taught me exactly what I never wanted to become. Those children trusted you. They looked up to you. And you shattered that trust, for gambling money. The prosecutor stepped forward, introducing character witness statements. Parent after parent had written about the devastation their children felt when programs were slashed. How they struggled to understand why the man they admired, the one who once organized their activities, had suddenly disappeared. Mrs. Rivera writes, Frank began, reading aloud, my daughter Isabella asked me why Mr. Duca doesn't come to the center anymore. She said she thought he cared about the kids, but then all the fun activities stopped. I didn't know how to tell my 8-year-old that sometimes people lie. Objection. Tony's lawyer barked. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, the defendant's past relationship with the court, overruled, Frank declared firmly. Mr. Duca opened this door when he chose to bring up our history. Now he gets to hear all of it. Frank rose from behind the bench, something he almost never did, and stepped forward, locking eyes with Tony. 43 years ago, you taught me that this world has people who take pleasure in inflicting pain. You taught me that some people choose cruelty simply because they can. And today, you've shown that some people never change, never grow, never rise above their worst impulses. The air in the courtroom was charged. Every spectator could feel it. This wasn't just a sentencing. This was a reckoning. But here's what you could never teach me, Mr. Duca, and what you still fail to understand. Justice is not about revenge. It's about protection. It's about making certain that bullies like you never again harm the innocent. Leave a comment below with what you think Judge Caprio should decide, and make sure you're subscribed, because the sentence he's about to deliver will shock every single person in that courtroom. Frank returned to his seat on the bench and flipped open the sentencing guidelines. The maximum punishment for the charges was 2 years behind bars along with full restitution. But Judge Frank Caprio had something else in mind, something that would etch this case into courtroom history. Mr. Duca, Frank declared, I hereby sentence you to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months, contingent upon full repayment of the $50,000 you stole, plus interest and administrative costs totaling $15,000. Tony's attorney exhaled, visibly relieved. Could have been worse, he thought. But Frank wasn't finished. In addition, Frank continued, as a condition of your parole, you will complete 500 hours of community service, specifically at the East Side Youth Center, under strict supervision. You will help rebuild the very programs you destroyed. You will personally apologize to every family harmed by your theft, and you will draft a written apology that will be read aloud at every community meeting for the next year, detailing how your actions damaged children's lives. The courtroom erupted in applause. Tony's complexion shifted from pale to crimson with humiliation. And furthermore, Frank pressed on, his voice cutting through the noise, during your community service, you will wear an identification badge that reads, Volunteer in Restitution, so that everyone understands you are there not out of kindness, but as atonement for your wrongdoing. Tony's lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is excessive, humiliating, objection overruled, Frank snapped. Mr. Duca chose to humiliate children. Now he will endure humiliation while helping them. The sentence stands. But Frank wasn't finished. He had one final strike, one that no one in the room could have predicted. He fixed his eyes on Tony. You know, Mr. Duca, 43 years ago you asked me a question behind DeMarco's grocery. You asked me if my father was still fixing shoes for pennies. I never answered you then. The courtroom went silent. Every breath was held. My father, Jeppy Caprio, came to this country with nothing. Yes, he repaired shoes, sometimes for pennies. He worked 16-hour days so his son could receive an education. He never stole from children. He never took what didn't belong to him. He built his life with his hands and with integrity. Frank's voice swelled with pride. That day, you tried to make me ashamed of my father's work. Instead, you taught me to honor it. Every single day I sit on this bench, I remember that I am the son of a shoemaker who believed in honest labor and treating people with dignity. The emotion in the room was overwhelming, nearly tangible. Tears streaked down several faces in the gallery. Today, Mr. Duca, Frank declared, you will learn what my father already knew, that true strength is found in lifting people up, not breaking them down. That real power lies in protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Tony stood in silence, every trace of arrogance stripped away. This court is adjourned, Frank said, striking the gavel one final time. But as the courtroom began to empty, the unexpected unfolded. Tony Duca, the boyhood tormentor of Frankie Caprio, now the disgraced man sentenced for stealing from children, turned back as the bailiff guided him out. Judge Caprio, he called. Frank glanced up from his papers. I'm sorry, Tony said quietly. Not just for the money, for everything. For what I did to you when we were kids. For what I did to those children. I'm sorry. The room fell into utter silence. Frank studied Tony's face for a long moment, searching for something genuine in eyes that had once radiated only cruelty. "Mr. Duca," Frank said at last, "apologies are not an ending, they are a beginning. You'll have time to prove whether you truly mean those words." As Tony was escorted out, Frank sank back into his chair, the enormity of the moment pressing on him. 43 years of pain, anger, and resolve had culminated in this act of justice. But the story did not close there. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon, because what happened next would restore faith in redemption, and prove that sometimes, the truest revenge is found in living with integrity and protecting others. 18 months later, Judge Frank Caprio opened an unexpected letter. It was from Tony Duca, written from prison. "Dear Judge Caprio," it began. "I have spent every day of the last year and a half reflecting on what you told me in that courtroom. You were right about everything. I was a bully as a boy, and I became another kind of bully as a man. I hurt you when we were young, and I hurt children when we were old. I am not writing this letter to ask for anything. I am writing to tell you that you changed my life by showing me what real strength is." The letter stretched for 3 pages, describing Tony's sessions with counselors, his recognition of the cycle of cruelty that shaped him, and his resolve to make amends. "I know I cannot undo the harm I caused you, or those children," the letter concluded. "But when I am released, I want to spend the rest of my life, proving that people are capable of change. Thank you for teaching me that fairness and compassion can stand together in the same breath." Frank kept that letter tucked in his desk drawer. Not because he had already forgiven Tony, forgiveness would come slowly, earned by steady actions, but because it reminded him why he had chosen to become a judge in the first place. The East Side Youth Center was rebuilt, stronger than before, with new programs and protections to prevent future theft. The kids got back their basketball league, their Christmas celebration, and their hope renewed. And Judge Frank Caprio kept doing what he always had, shielding the vulnerable, treating every person with respect, and proving daily that the little boy once bullied behind DeMarco's grocery store had grown into exactly the man his father had raised him to be. Justice, Frank understood that day, wasn't about revenge against bullies. It was about making sure they could never harm anyone else. And sometimes, if fortune allows, it's about guiding them to become better than they once were. The case of the state versus Anthony Duca became the most viewed episode in Providence Municipal Court history. Not for its drama, but because it demonstrated that our past doesn't have to lock in our destiny, yet our choices always shape our character. In the end, young Frankie Caprio got his justice against Tony Duca. He became everything Tony never could, a man who defended the weak instead of preying upon them. But Frank's true test arrived 6 months after Tony's release from prison. Tony had finished his community service at the East Side Youth Center. By every account, he had sincerely changed. He worked relentlessly with the kids, never grumbled about the humility of his volunteer badge, and built real bonds with the families he once harmed. On a freezing February morning, Tony appeared again in Frank's courtroom, this time, only as a spectator, not a defendant. He had come to support his nephew, who was facing vandalism charges. After the case ended, Tony stepped up to the bench. "Your Honor," Tony said softly. "I know this may seem improper, but I wanted to thank you. Not only for the sentence, but for showing me the kind of man I could still become." Frank looked closely at Tony's face. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar but real, humility. "How are the children at the center?" Frank asked. Tony's eyes brightened. "They're amazing, Your Honor. There's this boy, Miguel. He reminds me of," he paused, lowering his gaze to his hands. "Reminds me of you, when we were kids. Bright, determined. But the other children target him because he's different. And what do you do about that?" Frank asked. "I protect him," Tony answered plainly. "I show the bullies that there are consequences when they hurt someone smaller than them. I suppose you could say I learned that lesson the hard way." Frank gave a slow nod. "Mr. Duca, what you did in your youth, and what you did to those kids at the center, none of it can ever be erased. But what you decide to do every single day from here on, that is what defines you now." "I understand, Your Honor," Tony replied, And I promise I'll dedicate the rest of my life to proving that people really can change, that bullies can grow into protectors. As Tony began to walk away, Frank called after him one last time. Mr. Duca. Yes, Your Honor. That 12-year-old boy you once tormented, he forgives you. But more importantly, he's proud of the man you're becoming. Tony's eyes welled with tears. He gave a quiet nod and left the courtroom, carrying with him the greatest gift Frank could ever offer, the chance at redemption, and the understanding that even those who have fallen the furthest can still choose a better path. The case of the state versus Anthony Duca concluded not with vengeance, but with transformation. And Judge Frank Caprio showed once more that real justice isn't about punishment, it's about offering people the opportunity to become who they were meant to be. Years later, law students would examine this case in ethics courses. They would argue over whether Frank should have stepped aside, whether his decision was shaped by emotion, whether true justice had been served. But Frank already knew the truth. Justice wasn't carried out despite their shared past, it was carried out because of it. Because the frightened 12-year-old who had once been bullied behind DeMarco's grocery store had grown into a man who fully understood what it meant to be powerless. What it felt like to be exposed. And why defending the innocent mattered far more than satisfying personal grudges. At the East Side Youth Center, a plaque still hangs in the main hall, dedicated to the children who deserved better, and to the adults who chose to give it to them. It doesn't name Frank Caprio or Tony Duca, but everyone in the neighborhood knows the story behind it. And now and then, on quiet Sunday afternoons, you can still see Tony Duca there, teaching kids that the strongest people aren't the ones who can inflict harm. They're the ones who choose not to.